Right, so thank you very much, Agata, and thanks for everything that you've done to bring us together for this workshop. We really appreciate you, and as this is the last workshop, I want to especially acknowledge everything that you've done for us. So thank you, Agata.
Very
Okay.
welcome.
We're going to try to leave some more time for questions today, but I did want to kind of give you an overview of this issue of scaling and talk about what it means in the frameworks that we've been developing uh, regarding our overarching goal, which is, of course, to support you as innovators who want to make lasting change that improves lives. So our goal for today is to think about how to scale up, particularly how to scale up proven initiatives that have been piloted, where you feel like you have the evidence you need to overcome skepticism, to consider alternative approaches. You feel like you've got, your solution pretty well developed, and now the time has come to scale. So that'll be our focus today. Just to remind you, this is the sixth in a six-part series. The first five uh, workshops have been posted to the Innovate US website. You remember, of course, we started back in late March talking about, finding your right team and thinking about that. And we worked all the way through a series of issues around pilot projects, developing evidence, thinking about trade-offs and different types of goals and values. Last time we talked about growth and what that would involve, and now the focus is on scaling. I want to remind you that in September, we're going to be offering workshops for teams of innovators, and we'd be happy to hear from you if you're interested in being part of that. We will also be reminding you about that opportunity as the date draws nearer. And I want to ask everyone, please, to go to pisquared.burnscenter.org. So that's PISQUARED Burns, BURNES Center, CENTER.org/sign up. And I'm hoping that Agata, you could put that into the chat, that link in the chat, so that we can reach you when we start to offer these workshops. We'll be sending out a message to our newsletter recipients who have signed up about that opportunity. So please sign up for our newsletter so that you're aware of that. Okay, a brief review. We talked about getting started by building your team, finding like-minded, passionate innovators that want to work with you, narrowing your focus. So it's worthwhile to think about the big picture of what you're trying to accomplish. But ultimately, to get started effectively, you want to find small, high-leverage opportunities for impact. You want to think about how to overcome objections, how to bust myths, how to tie your agenda to a redefined public good, and create successes early on for partners that have to be engaged for you to win effectively. So, for example, if you're interested in bringing AI, for example, to the workflow of renewing driver's licenses in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, getting those frontline RMV workers to understand what you're trying to do, piloting a project, understanding how, drivers themselves are going to experience that, working with law enforcement, a few people from law enforcement that see the opportunity in what you're doing. So finding ways in which partners can have a voice and express what they're interested in. And then developing these early wins, looking for pilot projects, demonstrating your impact, building a shared understanding of what the problems may be, whether that problem is redeploying capacity of workers, for example, RMV workers on the front lines who now may have more time for other tasks, whether it's dealing with the concerns of law enforcement that be concerned that you've renewed licenses for people who really shouldn't have them renewed. So figuring out what's our shared understanding of the pros and cons of our implementation, and then thinking about innovating organizationally. What organizational impact is your innovation going to have? If you're focused on workflow redesign, you may be freeing up resources, and there may be questions about how to redeploy those resources. If you're thinking about strategic innovation, where you're going to have to compromise on some areas of performance in order to achieve, let's say, much greater efficiency. So let's say, you want to standardize what has been a customized service delivery process so you can make it much more efficient. It may be worth it to lose a little bit of customization in order to achieve that efficiency. You've got to get your head around that and understand that. Or are you trying to do structural innovation, especially around AI, where you're offering something completely new or novel? What are the implications of that for existing service delivery? So thinking these things through has been a subject of our focus. And in the past couple of sessions where we've looked at things like learning and pivoting and growing, we've really focused on differences between workflow redesign, where there's no compromise on what you're seeking to accomplish in terms of the values you're pursuing. Everybody agrees that the workflow redesign could deliver more value. The question is how to pull it off effectively. That's a good place to begin, especially as you're thinking about proving the opportunity with an innovation. Strategic innovation and structural innovation get more complicated, and the issues become more organizationally more complex, in the sense you have to engage more stakeholders. So really confronting, workflow redesign as a way in, as a tip of the wedge on what the opportunity may be for strategic and structural innovation, is what we've recommended. So we talked in the learning session about how to overcome barriers to technology adoption. And one of our kind of our sort of touch points is this idea that the barriers to technology adoption are not only technical, they also may be organizational and cultural. So really understanding where those barriers come from. If you're coming into a healthcare organization, especially a public organization, let's say a clinic, a health clinic, and you're seeking to use technology to improve, let's say, access to COVID vaccines or improve uptake of vaccines more generally. What are some of the trade-offs that could arise in conversations about whether that's worthwhile? Are people going to be worried about, the complications that can arise through a large-scale vaccination program, the objections that can arise, the capacity of an organization to support objectors? What are the organizational consequences in terms of skepticism and resistance to the quality of a vaccine? How are you going to deal with that? So giving up giving up you know what some people may conceptualize as quality may be unacceptable. How are you going to overcome? How are you going to deal with that? How are you going to create situations that get large scale support, arguments that get large scale support through settling those kinds of objections? And then as you grow, how do you measure your performance against historical standards and then come up with new measures of performance that reflect your ambitions? How are you going to understand compromises and go deep on stakeholder engagement to really confront what stakeholders need and how you can deliver solutions to the problems that are most important to them? And now today we're going to talk about, once you've figured that out, once you've identified exactly what your intervention is going to be, how are you going to scale that up? How are you going to do more without investing so much more that you lose the benefits of the scale economies? So we talked a little bit earlier in these workshops about how organizations are designed to make routine, through systems, the deployment of systems, make routine an efficient approach that can be scaled across, workflows, across organizations, and even across entire structural systems here. And I want to begin our conversation about scaling by just defining what an economy of scale is. I have my training in economics, and we spent an entire semester course in my PhD program talking about what an economy of scale is. I'm going to try to deliver through two charts the intuition on this. And I hope you ask me in the chat if this is confusing to you. But let me see if I can try to explain this clearly. So if you look on the left-hand chart here, what I've got is an axis that represents the cost per unit of work. So let me just give you an example here. The first pen that I may make may cost me, let's say, $25 to make because I'm got a I've got to 3D print the plastic. I've got to go get the ink and figure out a way to put it in some sort of a cartridge mechanism for my pen. I've got to develop a point. Actually, it probably cost me a lot more than $25. Let's say it cost $100 or maybe $150 to make the first pen because of the amount of different problems that I have to solve to make this pen. Once I make one, if I think about making two pens, I've doubled my volume. So I've got on the horizontal axis at the bottom cumulative volume. I moved from one pen to making two pens. I've learned something by making the first pen for $150. Let's say the second pen I can make for, let's say, $100. So my cost per unit has dropped from 150 down to 125 for two pens. So the first pen cost 150, the second pen cost $100. So my average cost of the two pens is 125. And if I keep adding pens, my costs per marginal pen are going down faster than my average cost. Let's say that a third pen costs $50. So now my average has gone from the average of 150 and 100 and $50 to $100 per pen. That's an average cost of $100 per pen. My average cost is going down as I get better and better, more effective and efficient at making pens. Now, eventually, I'm going to hit a point where each additional pen reduces my costs less. In other words, the cumulative volume, as it gets to a certain inflection point, it's going to kind of level out. So there's fewer economies of scale toward the right-hand side of that curve. The cost per unit of work goes down fast at the beginning, but then it begins to level out as my cumulative volume gets really high. Let's say tens of thousands of pens. Once I've made 10,000 pens, the 10,001st pen, I don't have as much learning from that. So my cost is not going down very much. That leveling out means that I've hit the limits on economies of scale. So initial costs are super high, but I want to make sure that I am, reducing my costs through learning, through getting manufacturing efficiencies, through building up volume-based discounts on the plastic that I have to buy, and so on. All those things come into play. And what I've done is reduced my cost per unit of work. This is especially relevant when you're doing digital delivery or AI-based delivery, because once you build the platform, once you build the algorithm, once you build the software that can deliver the service, the cost of adding one more user, one more analysis to the project, one more piece of service, one more customer at the window is usually pretty low once I hit that inflection point on cumulative volume. So what we're going for here is really systematically, adding volume to something that can handle it, that's a fixed cost, a platform, let's say, or some sort of fixed manufacturing process for pens that can handle one more at a much lower cost than at the beginning of the innovation process. The right-hand side represents the total costs rather than the average cost on the left-hand side. So what may be happening over time as volume accumulates is we may be starting at $125 per pen at the left-hand side, but each incremental, if you think of the total cost, now let's say we go from $150, we're adding another pen, costs $100 to make. That's a total of 250. Now the next one's $50. That's 300. We're increasing our costs, but incremental the increment to the total cost is beginning to level off as we hit some level of volume. And that threshold level is where the economies of scale um, have been actualized. In other words, more volume is basically free after a certain point in the process. So what does this all mean for us here? It makes sure we have to make sure that what we're doing is measuring what's important with regard to reducing costs. Now, I have a video here I'm not going to have time to show. I want to make sure that it's available to you and you can watch it on YouTube if you like. This video demonstrates the importance of measuring the right thing as for us today, measuring the right thing as you scale. What this video is going to show is uh, the challenge of seeing the big picture as you measure an element of a process. So the video shows a group of students here, some in white shirts and some in black shirts, passing around a basketball. And the instruction that I want to give you when you watch this for the first time is to try to count the number of passes over about a 3-minute period, which is the length of the video, the number of passes between the students in the white shirts. Okay, so count the number of passes and see if you can come up with the right number. All right, so watch the video the first time through and count the number of passes that the students in the white shirts make. Write that number down, and then watch the video a second time. And don't worry about counting. Just watch the video through to the end a second time, and see if you see something in the big picture that you missed the first time when you were counting. And then if you are still interested, you can look at the notes to the video and see what the right answer was to the number of passes. Okay? What you're going to find if you do that is that you'll see something the second time through you didn't see the first time through. And what happens is if once we define what we're trying to measure, once we get rigorous about trying to, for example, achieve economies of scale in our cost structure, deploy a platform that we find effective, it's easy to lose sight of the big picture on what's important. Okay, you're going to see in this video something the second time that's very important that you missed the first time. Okay, so, and the reason that you miss it is because you're focused on counting the number of passes and measuring what I've asked you to measure. And that means that what that means for us as implementers of innovation is that by the time we try to scale up and we try to measure the playing out of the cost structure over time, we had better be right about what we're deploying. In other words, the thing that we're trying to scale has to be shaken out. It has to be stress tested. It has to be piloted. It has to be interrogated. We have to know what the adversities are. We have to have done all the stakeholder work that I described last time, all the thinking about the trade-off between different values, the outcomes that can arise. All of that has to be thought through so that the thing you're trying to scale has got guardrails on it, barriers on its effectiveness. You understand what the problems are that could arise, and you're measuring efficiency against a broader framework of what's not acceptable and what's acceptable in the implementation of the technology. So as you build routines and workflow redesign, as you build new habits, new processes, as you amplify and standardize what your solution involves, what your innovation involves, you know what the problems are going to be. You've limited the size and deployment of a pen. You're not going to allow any pen to be deployed that does not have a point on it, that does not have an integrity in the cartridge. You know how to measure quality. You're going to stop the amplification and the escalation to scale if you hit some sort of boundary, on what's acceptable in terms of the value of the thing that you're doing. So you're achieving scale, but against a certain set of boundaries and conditions that you've put in place to limit potential adversities. You've achieved a breakthrough that resolves the compromises here. So, for example, if you are putting in a nursing system that uses AI to write reports, that frees up nursing capacity, you've already had the conversation on what those nurses are going to be doing to make sure that those AI written reports are internalized at the nursing station, and that any emergency that's or any concerns that are revealed by those reports are understood by the nurses, even though the nurses no longer write the reports. They have to uh, redeploy to read the reports to make sure that they understand what's happening. So you've thought that through in advance, and everybody agrees that it's worth doing the AI versions of the reports under those conditions. You've built in embedded learning. You're getting better and better at writing those reports, and the AI system is accommodating that learning over time, and that's what's lowering the cost. You've got to make sure that you have built into your workflow and redesign protocol for scaling that learning, that embedded learning. And you've thought through how you want to use the freed up resources and capabilities. Maybe, you're going to be able to redeploy nurses out of a particular hospital and redeploy them in some other place nearby, or you're going to be able to put them in a different clinical situation. What are the One of the things we want to avoid with workflow redesign is that that you don't free up the cost savings, that the cost savings are actually occurring through the deployment, even if it means that some nurses are going to be laid off. What are you have to have confronted that problem, that issue in advance of the scaling up, or the scaling up can't occur. So, especially if what you're doing is trying to pursue efficiency and economies of scale through cost reductions. So, making sure that you've thought that through in advance is the key message. If what you're doing is a strategic innovation, which of course has this kind of different implication of thinking about compromises. So you remember back in the beginning, we talked about how workflow redesign can allow you to achieve a 20% productivity improvement. A strategic innovation may take you to 300% of a productivity improvement. How do you get that 300%? You've got to think about how you scale as involving potentially the retraining of key personnel. Well, how are you going to do that in a way that's cost effective? The 3 years that you have to actually achieve to hit the scale economy, the threshold level of productivity improvement of 300% has to involve a retraining of key personnel potentially. How are you going to do that cost effectively during that 3 years through which the deployment occurs? How are you going to get the cost, the direct cost down? We know that this may involve stepping away from some clients and deepening commitments to others. I can do such a great job at fixing potholes on surface streets, let's say in New York City, that I need to delay resurfacing projects. Or let's say I can process building permit applications for non-elevator buildings so fast that I take capacity away from skyscraper applications where elevators are mandatory. How are you going to, reshuffle, building permit applications so that you don't focus so much on the efficiencies that you don't serve the exceptional cases in an efficient way? You've got to be ready for that redeployment challenge before you can achieve the scale economies. They don't happen automatically. They have to be managed. Resolving losses. In my neighborhood around here, many of our local libraries have closed as the library system has moved more toward an electronic model. Similarly, some of the local police stations have closed as the city has moved toward more remote surveillance. Um, are we prepared for that? Are we prepared for those closings? What's going to happen to those physical buildings, the personnel that are released? Have we thought that through? Have we resolved those losses? Okay, you can't achieve the lowering of costs until you have a strategy, have a plan for actually resolving those losses. You have to think about in the strategic innovation domain, what am I willing to cut off to achieve those efficiencies? What compromises can I accommodate? You know, I can't keep my library open to serve 15 diehards that are never going to use the electronic resources. So how do I let go of those stakeholders that may be long-time passionate advocates of my local library, but we just can't afford it. We can't afford to keep our local library open for the 15 people that really want that. Well, are we okay with that? Have we had that conversation and anticipated those objections and come to some sort of, peaceful sort of idea of how we're going to handle that? Have we recommitted to the people that want electronic library resources? Have we changed addressed the redistribution of value by changing the nature of the librarian's duties? All of that stuff has to unfold. All those conversations have to unfold for economies of scale to be realized. The issues are even more challenging on the structural side if what you're trying to do is drive synergies between organizational units in a structural domain. You've got great challenges. So let me explain um, what I mean by synergies. Synergies require massive investment, and in structural innovation in government, often a lot of synergies arise through data sharing across organizational units. For example, and this can occur within agencies or it can occur across agencies. So think, for example, within the Internal Revenue Service of the United States of America, the different a function of processing tax returns that are submitted annually by citizens of this of and commercial organizations within the United States. So processing tax returns versus the audit function versus the special records and analysis units. So units that take confidential records and do analysis of them to anticipate, say, future challenges. So you've got three different organizational units: the processing of tax returns, the auditing of tax returns, and kind of special analysis within the Internal Revenue Service. Let's say the auditing unit comes up with insights about how to make the processing unit more effective. How does that data get shared? How does that data get shared with the special records analysis unit? How do you respond to inquiries? How do you manage sensitive information securely? Those questions um, have to be answered in order for synergies across the different units to be realized. In other words, in order for learning to occur across organizational units. Now let's imagine that the data that could be shared is actually coming from different units of government. Earlier in this workshops, I talked about Michael Flowers' initiative to try to identify violators of laws within New York City on uh, the responsible disposal of dirty grease from restaurants. What was happening, he discovered, and his unit discovered, was that a lot of restaurants were actually just taking the illegal but immediately accessible route of dumping grease into the sewer system without having it cleaned in advance. And the way that he sought to resolve this problem involved merging data sets from the sewer department with the restaurant department. That was an heroic effort just to get access to the data. People will try to protect their resources, and they don't have the capacity, and they're not mandated to actually share them. So, you're awfully busy in the sewer department in New York City. These folks over in the restaurant division are equally busy. They don't have the time to easily, respond to Michael Flowers's unit. Achieving that synergy requires a lot of relationship building. So the reason that structural innovation can take up to 10 years is because achieving these synergies requires a lot of investment. Most mergers, acquisitions, partnerships in the public sector, in the private sector, in the corporate sector that are designed to try to achieve synergies, most of them fail to deliver. I was teaching yesterday a case study on a company, JP Morgan Chase, that has grown mainly through mergers of, first of all, JP Morgan and Chase, but then even before that, mergers of lots of little regional banks that were rolled together on the argument that their back office operations could be unified. In other words, if we have 15 different local banks across, let's say, the western, southwestern United States that each have their own data centers that process transactions every night. Think of how much money we could save if the 15 were reduced to just one data center. Well, guess what? That didn't happen for decades after the mergers occurred. Why? People had little idiosyncratic pieces of software in each of these data centers. There were all sorts of embedded routines that were not well documented. So we were worried that if we tried to merge them, we would lose processing capacity that was important in one bank, but not in another. This kind of problem runs rampant through government. You're trying to save money through, unifying data gathering systems, but there's not good documentation. We don't even know, we can't afford to have the system go down even for one day. How are we going to achieve these synergies? It becomes very difficult. And I want to say that we've learned in the private sector, and I believe that this has also been shown to be true in the public sector, that changes in these arrangements can cause internal battles that sometimes have been characterized as civil war. You know, I used to teach a case study on LL Bean, a company in Maine that was known for its friendliness to customers who sought to, buy outdoor gear for camping trips and, hiking trips and stuff like that. LL Bean, when it sought to create an internet division to replace its retail operations, internally had to learn to work very differently, and in a way where the local retailers felt very threatened, and that threat, in JP Morgan Chase, the rumor was that if your email address ended with chase.com, and you were supposed to cooperate with someone whose email address ended with jpmorgan.com, you took this as an opportunity for rectifying old grievances and finding retribution for old competitive interactions. So fiefdoms, let me see here. Fiefdoms, proprietary access. There are tons and tons of examples of internal conflict that can arise where synergies are desired. And it's because people don't want to work together because they've been in conflict for years. And it's very difficult. Think of community policing versus tactical policing versus analytics and policing, and all the different cultural challenges associated with getting collaboration across those unit boundaries in local policing. That gets amplified to the nth degree when our goal is to achieve greater efficiencies. So elevating and cultivating commitments to the outcomes that become possible through, let's say, AI deployments, it requires a lot of work to have those conversations and to focus on stakeholders that are best served by new approaches and you know, redesigning systems to, make that effective becomes extremely, extremely difficult. So what will stop you as you try to deploy and achieve scale economies? On the left-hand side, in workflow redesign, it's the escalation of costs over time as opposed to the achievement of efficiencies. So, hypothetically, the nurses that used to write reports are relieved of that responsibility through an AI system. But guess what? They need even more time to read the reports. And now you've asked them to also, do other work because they're supposed to be freed up from reading, writing these reports. Well, that other work, together with reading the reports, together with implementing the system, actually increases costs instead of decreases costs over time. That escalation of costs and not anticipating the objections to the system that are behind that, it'll cause you to fail in scaling. On the strategic innovation side, where you're trying to introduce new compromises into established systems, stakeholders that you can't serve effectively, like those 15 people that still want the local library to be open, if they're successful in their argument, you are now offering an electronic library to 99% of the people that used to use that local branch library, and you're keeping the local branch open. So you've now just failed to achieve efficiencies. Old ways of thinking about what constitutes value, if those are not addressed and the compromises aren't achieved, you're trying to be all things to all people, and your costs escalate instead of decline with scale. Okay? On the structural side, if you expect everyone to like a structural change where you're going to have to set aside an old way of doing things, you are going to fail. You will never be able to achieve the efficiencies that you desire if you're not willing to reset expectations about customization in a system that's designed to standardize transactions. If what your customers enjoy is a customized service and your system is designed for standardized service, you won't, unless you confront that problem and deal with it and build in to your system the kinds of high touch experiences systemically that you need to satisfy that need, you're not going to be able to achieve the cost savings that were initially in your sights. If you try to seek synergies where they can occur or fail to recognize this kind of organizational conflict that I'm calling civil wars, you can't succeed. It needs leadership to set a line in the sand on what's going to happen. And this problem, by the way, has been well documented under what we call the innovator's dilemma. This phrase, the innovator's dilemma, reflects a concept that was introduced by Professor Clay Christensen in the 1990s, and it describes how over time, so if we think about the horizontal axis over time, the amount of value that is created by a particular innovation tends to follow these what he called S curves. So think of the left-hand side S curve as representing the path over time that was created, say, by something like the introduction of the telephone or the light bulb. There's a period of relatively low value creation as the system is implemented. Then it rapidly escalates over a short period of time, and then the system hits maturity and there's less and less opportunity to create value. In the 1990s, everybody had a landline telephone, a telephone in their house that was connected through a cord, possibly to the, either to your broadband system or the old telephone system that my grandparents had in New York City for a million years. And what's happening is internet IP is supporting now, new ways of providing internet-based telephony, and cellular telephones are evolving. initially they underperformed landlines, right? They were spotty. The service was not ubiquitous. You could drive into dark spots. You could go to places that didn't have strong signal. But over time, as that improved, the cellular telephony system improved, it started to outperform landline telephones. And what happened was, over time, uh, uh, landline telephones, which were extremely profitable, um, had to give way. We saw great companies that offered heritage technology, one after the other, that were incredibly profitable, hit a wall. AT&T got broken up. Blockbuster went out of business as Netflix grew. Kodak went out of business as digital cameras took off, and then as Apple and Samsung started to build that technology into our mobile devices. So you see, the innovator's dilemma occurred time and time again with structural innovation, which is, it takes way longer to achieve the kind of structural breakthroughs that you anticipate. The old system prevails for way longer than you anticipated. And then there's a kind of wall that gets hit. For Kodak, it was in the holidays of the year 2005. For Blockbuster, it was in the year 2012. For most cellular services, people are starting to think about cutting their landlines on their, on their home telephones in the 1990s. Now, many of us are thinking about cutting off our cable TV because you can get so much over internet. So, the innovator's dilemma is this idea that it takes way longer to do structural innovation than you initially anticipate. Let me stop there. We're going to have time today for some questions. I'm hoping, Agata, that you will turn off the recording so that we can start to think about together how to workshop some of these ideas and what people's questions are.